Hello, welcome back. Mr. Boyle with us? Okay, before I ask Ms. Perec to proceed, just two points. One is you may well have received Mrs. Brady's comments on the 106 debate yesterday, which I'll give both of you an opportunity to respond to in relation to those aspects which affect the appeal proposal at some point in the day. And secondly, in response to Mr. Boyle's point, the plan that you referred to about the itinerary hasn't yet been received by the inspectorate. So if it could either be resent or just some clarity on whether it's come from the council or the appellants would be helpful. Anybody help me on that point?
Madam, I'm just looking into my phone, just trying to get electronic instructions on that latter point. But I have just seen from my instructing officer that they haven't received the first thing that you mentioned, which was it the comments from Ms. Brady? Okay,
I'll just send a note in a moment asking them to be sent on.
Thank you.
Mr. Boyle, did I understand you correctly that a plan had been sent?
I may have misunderstood an email that I had. So there is a plan which has got the, is it Gemma? Is that Gemma Cox? Presumably? Yes. Yes. So there's a plan which Miss Cox has marked up and has sent to us. So that's the plan that's on its way to you via the inspectorate, madam. But I think I would jump the gun. It hasn't yet been sent.
Okay, thanks. I'll tell Miss Humphries to stop looking for it in that case until.
And then, as with Nun and Friend, we haven't yet had the comments from Mrs. Brady, but we'll get those in due course.
Thank you.
And Madam, just to update, my officer says that Mrs. Wright and Ms. Cox have in fact agreed the views between them, and they're just due to send them to you.
Thank you. In that case, Ms. Perec, your witness.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Cook. Sorry, I just had a brain freeze. Probably Mr. Boyle's influence rubbing off on me there. I'm usually quite good with names. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm going to say good afternoon because I think it's just turned the hour. So there you go.
I think it's turned 11.
It's still 11 o'clock.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I'm in a different time zone, obviously.
You've clearly had a very long week, Mr. Cook, juggling multiple inquiries.
Yes.
Right.
So
we're
not faring very well, are we? Times and names.
Absolutely. But well, kicking off with fun clues then. You are concerned with the landscape and visual impacts arising from the proposed scheme, and yes. You have very helpfully provided your proof, and I just want to begin by looking at the policy context, which hopefully will largely be common ground. And in fact, I do want to turn up the actual policies because you do set them out in your section 5. So as you've noted there, you've accepted that the work primarily concerned with local plan policies EM1 and EM10, and then in terms of neighbourhood development plan policies, you look also at H3 and LBE1. So to start then, I just want to look at EM1, which you set out at page 29 to 30 of your proof.
Just turn that up. Yes, at EM1. Yes.
Yes, and sorry, just pausing there before we move on, both for your benefit and the inspectors, there are probably a number of your appendices that I will need to turn up, but definitely your own Pegasus LVIA, which is Appendix 9, and your some of the landscape character assessment appendices, which I believe, Madam, are Appendix 5 and Appendix 3 as well.
Okay.
Thank you. So just going back then to policy EM1, it starts at page 29 of your proof, and we see there, do we not, that the policy requires proposals to be sympathetic to the character and visual quality of the area, and yes. proposals must not be detrimental to the character or visual amenity of the area. And what the policy asks us to do is to have particular regard to a number of features that are listed from A to H. And that includes the qualities identified within the council's landscape character assessment and any subsequent updates or relevant guidance. And that is, of course, something you've looked at, haven't you?
Yes.
Then you look also at visual amenity and also scenic quality.
Yeah.
And the setting of the settlement and so on. I won't read them all, but I will just go to the next paragraph that contains the text after the bullet points, which says, development proposals must also respect the sense of place, sense of tranquility or remoteness, and quiet enjoyment of the landscape from public rights of way.
Yes.
So you accept, do you, that these are all qualities that, or rather elements that you need to consider in reaching an overall assessment on compliance with this policy?
Yes, as it sets out in the policy. I mean, it is set out there as you've just quoted from it, and all of these elements need to be taken in the round, I would suggest, when you analyse the scheme and weigh the scheme against this particular policy.
Yes, absolutely.
You've
Great.
got to take all of these points in the round, haven't you?
Yes, and I won't dispute that at all. But in order to take them all in the round, you'd have to go through sort of individual elements where they apply, because not all of them might apply in a given case.
There's a checklist, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so that I think we would probably agree is the main policy, and I'm not going to take you to the other individual neighbourhood development plan policies. And then just working through that section of your proof, we then come on to, at page 34, valued landscapes.
Yes.
And it is, of course, common ground that this site is not a valued landscape. So I don't think we need to concern ourselves with your assessment there.
Yes, that's my understanding in terms of the agreement between the parties.
Yeah, we're not in paragraph 174A territory in the NPPF. And
yes.
we are, in fact, in the territory of paragraph 174B.
Can I turn that up?
Yes, absolutely.
Just for the wording. In terms of the intrinsic basic character and beauty of the countryside, B, yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the wording there is recognising the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside.
Yes.
And
intrinsic meaning basic, effectively. Yes, the character and beauty of the countryside. Yes.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think we probably have our own view on what intrinsic means, but surely intrinsic also means inherent,
yes,
as opposed to basic. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So, were you? Can I just check? Were you able to watch Mrs. Wright's evidence yesterday?
No, I've seen, because I got back late from an inquiry yesterday, but I have seen Mr. Dudley's cross-examination.
Okay, well,
so that's all.
That's absolutely fine. The only reason I ask is because the point I was just about to check with you is something that I put to her as well. Not that it matters, because obviously your judgment is your own professional judgment.
Yes.
But just so that we're clear on this point, and while we're looking at 174B, do you accept that as a matter of principle, the harm to a non-valued landscape is capable of being a significant harm in and of itself?
There can be significant harm that can flow from a non-valued landscape, clearly, yes.
Yes, and
that scenario can exist. I don't believe that is the case here, but theoretically, yes, we can have that scenario, yes.
Thank you. And just similarly on that point, that such significant harm, if it did exist in the appropriate case, it is capable of being a legitimate and single reason for refusal.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
If it's set out a reason for refusal and the council's evidence, yes.
Absolutely. Right. Okay. So I think, having agreed how we are to assess compliance with this policy and compliance in terms of NPPF, I just want to turn then to this appeal, And in terms of background, really, just to confirm, you have been instructed at the appeal stage, haven't you? So you weren't involved in the application stage?
No, I wasn't, no.
And you had no involvement in the original LVIA, which I understand was prepared by Terra Firma?
No, I hadn't. No, that's correct.
And I just note that in quite a few places in your proof, you do mention that this is a landscape-led scheme, but just to confirm, you didn't actually input into that landscape-led process.
No, I didn't. No, I was, my involvement, start of this project was at the appeal stage when the appellant decided to appeal against the reason for refusal. But my early involvement at that stage was clearly to review the proposal as part of reviewing whether I was prepared to take on the instruction. And in terms of reviewing the proposal and all the relevant documentation, I very firmly believe that this is very much a landscape-led project proposal. And I think that is manifest in the fact that there is such a significant amount of green infrastructure, which forms the majority of the site. It's quite exceptional for such a small residential scheme to be delivering such a quantum of green infrastructure and open spaces as is proposed here.
Thank you. So just turning then to the actual site itself,
Yes.
Are we in agreement? I mean, actually, maybe just to get our bearings, we could perhaps look at the parameters plan, which is your Appendix 10, I believe.
Yes, just bear with me.
Appendix 11. Sorry, Madam, Appendix 11.
Yeah, I was just going to. Yes, I was trying to find Appendix 10 and I was struggling to find the parameters plan. I've got it. Yes, Appendix 11.
Yes, thank you. So really just have brought it out so that we're all sort of looking at the site in the same orientation. But yes. Just to go over the actual site itself. Now, yes. It's correct, isn't it, that the northern and western boundaries are defined by mature trees and hedgerows?
They are, yes, quite substantial. And I think you've seen, we can get the measure of that in some photographs. Clearly, the inspector will see that on site, yes.
Yes. And
the only thing to qualify it, and it is just a detail point, is that clearly we should be aware that there is an area of historic quarry and fill, which is that rectangular area, which yes. forms that the western boundary wraps around. So when you're talking about the northern and the western boundaries being defined by mature tree cover, clearly the western boundary in part wraps around that historic area of fill,
yes.
and then reverts to mature tree cover. So there's an indent, if you like. So just a point of qualification on that description.
That is correct, and the inspector will no doubt see that on site as well. So that's the northern and western boundary, and then just in terms of the southern boundary, it isn't demarcated in the same way, but close to the southern boundary at least, there is a partial hedgerow, isn't there?
Yes, this is a parameters plan, so it's not picking up every last detail, but there is some existing vegetation on the southern boundary. Yes, and you can see that in some of the photo views.
Yes,
it's a mature hedge, mature tree hedge.
Is it not a hedgerow as opposed to mature trees in the way that the
Sorry, I'll just clarify that. The red line sits just south of an existing field boundary.
Yes, and actually perhaps the better photo for that is probably in your proof. If you just bear with me a second, I'll bring it up.
So if you go to viewpoint 6, that might assist.
Actually, if we can look actually at page 7 of your proof, which provides the aerial photography.
Okay.
Sorry, Appendix 7, you say?
No, I think it's
no, madam.
page
Page
7. Approved.
Page 7 of Mr. Cook's proof.
Just bear with
Yeah.
me. I just managed to close it rather than go to the right page.
And if it helps, madam, if you look at my appendix, I'm just looking for the reference, 22, I think it is, my viewpoint 6. Photo views, my appendix 22 viewpoint 6 is looking towards that southern part of the site, and you can see that feature in the photograph there.
So bear with me, it's just taking a moment to load.
That's fine. If you're able to have the two side by side, I don't know if that's
Yep, no one.
the IT is challenging.
So viewpoint 6, you said?
Viewpoint 6, I think, will probably assist, I think,
Yep.
on this point.
I have that.
Thank you, madam. See, that's that. So if we look first at figure 2 on page 7, if you have that open as well, you can see that there's this sort of partial hedgerow that's quite close to the southern red line, but not quite there.
It runs parallel and to the north of, doesn't it?
Yes. And if we turn then to viewpoint 6, that quite helpfully shows the nature of that hedgerow.
Yes.
And just to confirm, Mr. Cook, now, because of that sort of partial and hedgerow nature as opposed to mature trees in the way that we have along the northern and western boundaries, you would agree that it doesn't currently screen the views or the site in precisely the same way, does it?
No, it doesn't. You can see through, you can't see the nature of the site in terms of the arable field. So you haven't got an appreciation of the field there, but what you can see is across the through that boundary, you can see the existing housing, which primarily relates to the 7 acres
Yes.
neighbourhood.
Yes, and that's of course just the viewpoint from one point, but in general terms, that there is some visibility. There would be some visibility over that hedgerow because it's not quite as tall.
Yes, as I've just explained, you get a view straight across the site to the existing residential area there, as you can see in that view. And you say one view, but it's about the only view. But the inspector will gauge that for us.
Absolutely, and we'll come on to viewpoints in a little while. So just finishing off on the site really, and the nature of the site. And I just want to look at topography briefly. But before we do that, can I confirm that the site itself slopes from south to north, with the southern part being the most elevated?
Yes, in very broad descriptions, but it also has a fall from west to east as well. So when you blend the two falls, the northeastern corner is the lowest part of the site. But when you talk about the land rising to the southern boundary, it actually plateaus out quite significantly.
Yes, and we can see that probably from the topography.
Yeah, so
that
so if you go to Appendix 14, which is the topo plan, you can just see how much sorry, madam, have you got that plan?
I'm just going to it now.
Yes, no, that's fine. I'm just aware that I tend to race ahead and everybody else has got to be able to find the plans I'm referring to.
Okay, I have that now.
Okay, so the point I was just going to make is, yes, there is that detailed micro topographic relief across the site that we've just referred to, but when you look at it in broad terms, and you can see from this plan, you can see that the site sits on a plateau in the same way as the adjacent residential area. There's topographic continuity there at the macro level.
Mr. Cook, now that's very helpful in terms of a macro level, but if we look at a micro level, it's correct, isn't it, that actually the southern portion is more exposed because it's sort of higher on the valley side than the northern portion of the site.
When you say more exposed, I don't know what you're specifically referring to.
Okay, so let's turn actually then to your LVIA, which is Appendix 9.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I've got two screens open, so I might just have to look away from you. So your Appendix 9 at paragraph 3.5, which describes the landform and topography. 3.5. It's page 8.
Yes, I have that.
Yeah. So your what you say there is that the landform within the site falls gradually from a high point of 120 meters AOD, and as you describe, it falls to approximately 105 AOD in the northeastern corner. But more importantly, what you say there is the site is situated on the northerly facing shallow valley sides. So it's exposed in that sense, isn't it, to the opposing valley side to the north?
If you just looked at purely in terms of topography, that would be technically correct. But what you've got to do is bearing in mind that topography and the topographic profile needs to be capable of being appreciated in terms of its legibility. And what you've got to appreciate is that on the northern boundary, north of the site, there is existing development and mature tree cover. So your opportunity to be able to appreciate that fall, as you've suggested across the site in terms of any sort of exposed suggests that it's very, very visible. That you simply can't appreciate that from the north to any great degree for two reasons. If you go immediately to the north of the site, the gradient steepens as you go down into the River Test Valley, and as a consequence of that steep slope, existing settlement pattern and mature tree cover, you've got no line of sight back or appreciation of that slope, so therefore no sense of exposure. And if you then go into the valley bottom, you can't see the site. If you go up the other side of the valley, you're now at a more elevated level looking back across, which is what Mr. Dudley was referring to, and probably where you were taking me on the point, but in that context, you've got to appreciate the northern part of the site is framed by mature tree cover of a height which is comparable to all the difference in level across the site. So you just really don't have that sense of, when you say that the site is exposed, that suggests it's visible and highly visible, and that simply just doesn't come across, and that's not borne out by the photography. And if that were the case, the council would have presented photographs to make that point from the other side of the valley.
So just to be clear, on the fact that the site is on the northerly facing shallow valley side, as you say,
it's technically correct.
That is technically correct.
Technically correct. It is at the top of a very shallow dry valley, and that northeastern corner of the site is just at the head of a dry valley descending down as a tributary into the Test Valley, and the rest of the site forms part of the plateau.
Thank you. So just on the other points that you mentioned about how you experience it, of course, the inspector will see for herself. But just to finish off on the topography, because I know you touched a bit upon the macro, and I just want to shake you to the micro level. So we see already the 15-meter drop from your LVIA, where you say 105 to 120, but we can also see it, I think, in core document 1.2, which is the design and access statement. Do you have access to that?
Turn that up.
And once you and the inspector have that up, it's pages 56 to 57.
Okay, bizarrely, my electronic versions of the core docs start at 1.2, did you say?
Yes.
Mine start at 1.10.
It's one of the original submissions of the
Yeah.
application.
All right. Okay. Well, I'm happy for you to refer to the plan. Just don't have it in front of me. Okay.
I think that might be a bit difficult because
Right.
I'm just looking at the contour lines that show it at a much micro level compared to the, the typography plan that had sort of a different scale and didn't really show you how this all sits together. I'm not sure whether the best thing to do might be to share my screen, madam.
Yes, if you could do that.
If you wish, I'm not sure whether you'll need the permission switched on by Democratic Services. So if you just bear with me, you can attempt it, and if
yes, I think madam, I'll just need to make Ms. Parecka co-host to be able to do that. Just bear with me.
Thank you.
Just see if I've got a hard copy of it to hand. Is the design access statement dated August 20?
I'll just double check that. Give me one
it
second.
is, yeah.
Yes, it is.
Right, I have a hard copy here. Sorry, with me getting back late last night. Right, I've got a hard copy of the August 2020 design access statement.
Brilliant, thank you. So if you could just turn to page 56 and 57, which is the spread of what's called, I think, the considerations plan.
Yes, I have that. I can see that.
Yes, thank you. And that I just wanted to flag that to show that it shows a more representative spread of the typography in terms of at the microsite level, doesn't it?
It does reflect what we've been talking about, but what I point out from the inspector on this plan is that you can see how the site broadly divides north-south with a north field, south field, madam. And if you look at the north field, you can see the head of that dry tributary valley I was talking about. And so the northern development area would sit within that area adjacent to the existing residential area. If you look at the southern field, southern part of the site, you can see that the site is much flattens out considerably, and there's a much more even gradient, and you're out of the tributary valley at that point. And there is a gentle fall, but it's a very gentle fall. But the point I would note is the contours go due east into the adjacent area, existing residential areas, particularly 7 acres. And so where the southern development area is proposed, that would share the same topographic continuity as enjoyed by 7 acres and the adjacent residential area.
Mr. Cook, now you're obviously the expert on this, but just at the southern portion of the site where the lines actually run sort of east to west, surely that indicates that it's still northern facing aspect at that point, adjacent to 7 acres.
Yes, it is.
The site is northern, isn't it?
Yes, but the point I'm making is that the fall across there is very gentle and very shallow. It's almost level. And that's reflected by the fact, if you note, we were saying that there's a 15-metre fall approximately across the site from north to south. Well, if you look at the number of contours across there, you'll see that in the bottom southern southern part of the site, the contour 120 metres. And then you've got a bold line. So you've got one bold line. And then if you look and you go north, you can see that there are a couple of other bold lines. You see those?
Mm-hmm.
And they will be they'll be approximately the 5-metre contour intervals. So you can see that the nature of the fall in that southern part of the site where the proposed development is, it's very gentle. And it's almost, and you can see that on site, you can see that from the photographs, that it's almost level. And the real gradient starts to occur in that northern field. And you can see that's where the contours are bunched up. So the closer the contour lines together, the steeper the gradient, the fall. So that's the point I'm making, is that that southern field has got a very shallow gradient. It's almost flat. The inspector will see that. It relates to the plateau. Northern field, very different situation, start of the dry valley, and then you've got significant gradient dropping down. And it's that right-hand side of that valley where there is that northern residential enclave. So hopefully that clarifies the point.
Yeah, so I think we certainly are agreed on the technical aspects of this. And as far as it comes to the experience on site, the inspector will, of course, make her own judgment. Yeah. But while we are still talking about typography, I just want to confirm that actually that's the southern elevated portion, as you've said, because it steeps quite, it slopes downwards when you get to the northern part. But when we're looking at the southern part, which is the most elevated, that's where the majority of the houses are going to go. Isn't that correct?
Yes, it is. And whilst it is technically locally elevated ground, it's not elevated above the adjacent area. You can see the contours flowing through. You see the 120 again. If you look at that contour, you see it goes effectively due east towards Stapley Lane. You can see that
this is on a valley side, isn't it? So it is obviously elevated compared to how it sits compared to the sort of the valley bottom.
I would maintain that the southern part of the site is on the plateau, as is the adjacent residential area, and that's the character of the settlement in that immediate vicinity. And it's the northeastern part of the site that starts to pick up the gradient and drop down into a tributary valley as it relates to the Test Valley.
But do you stand by also what you say in your own LVIA, which is that this site in itself is on the valley side?
Technically, the northern part of the site, you can clearly see from those contours is, but the southern part of the site is more related to the plateau. But clearly there is technically, as I said, there is a gentle shallow fall. So technically it's falling north. Technically it's relating to that valley, isn't it? Because the fall is in that direction. I'm just saying that the fall is almost imperceptible in that southern field. It's plateau. It reads as plateau. Northern part definitely falls towards the valley.
I just want to check though, because obviously you have said that this is a landscape led scheme quite a few times in your proof, and you've confirmed that you've assessed that for yourself.
Yeah.
But if you were concerned first and foremost with landscape impact, would common sense not dictate that you would place housing on the least exposed part of the site? So you wouldn't place it where it's on sort of the highest plateau bit, as you say, where it's more visible in its surroundings?
Well, that's suggesting that visibility in this instance is deemed to be harmful, and that you're trying to screen and cloak the proposal such that you can't see it from anywhere. And that's not the case here. This is a quality scheme, and it should be capable of being seen and visible. It should be. I've just come away from another inquiry, and the AONB document, there's a design guide about residential development, and it says that quality design should be good enough to be seen, and shouldn't be capable and shouldn't be necessary to screen it. So
we'll come on to the visual amenity, obviously, and of course it'll be a judgment for the inspector to take whether it will be harmful to look at or not.
But you were taking me to the point about, you were saying that if you were going to take a landscape-led approach, you'd put the housing in the lowest part so it was less visible, it was set down, and I'm inferring from that effectively more screened. What is appropriate is to look at the context. And when you look at the context, you've got to bring into a number of factors. One factor is access, and there are a number of logical access points into the site. It's also right to take into account the development context. And what you have here immediately abutting contiguous to the site is 7 acres on the eastern boundary, which is a real exemplar scheme in terms of quality design, I believe, and very attractive to look at. And so I think it's right to consider, in terms of a design which is comparable to that high quality, being situated in that flatter area of the site. It would be framed by a landscape framework. And then the northern development area is going to sit alongside what is currently quite a harsh and unresolved edge, which I think there's agreement between ourselves and the council from Mr. Dudley's evidence that the residential neighbourhood associated with Pond Close area, as it relates to that adjacent field, is quite a hard, unresolved edge. And this provides the opportunity to address that and enhance it with this small enclave to the north. So I think it's very much landscape led.
That's a very helpful explanation. I just want to unpick some of that. So 3 points really first. You say context is really important. Would you agree that an important context also is that this is currently open countryside?
I mean, clearly it's open countryside. That is the starting point in terms of this site, isn't it?
Yeah. So you happy?
If you're looking at this site, it's beyond the settlement boundary as it stands at the moment.
Yes,
but in the context that clearly it's being considered as a potential suitable site for growth of the settlement going forward. We were referring to Site K earlier.
Yes, and I will move on to that shortly. So just you've confirmed that an important aspect of probably the starting point in terms of context is that this is open countryside we're talking about. The second point you have said.
To qualify that, what you have to
Mr. Cook, can I just ask you to let Ms. Peck put her questions to you so that you can then respond rather than cutting across her?
Thank you. The second point you mentioned was, of course, the high quality design of the scheme.
Yes.
But just to confirm, design is, of course, a matter for reserved matters, isn't it? So we don't have that detail at this moment.
We don't, but we do have a very good indication in terms of what is proposed in two forms. One, we're looking at the design access statement, which is in front of us. And that gives a clear indication and steer in terms of what is proposed. But I accept your point. And secondly, if we need to see some evidence trail, it is the same developer who built and completed the adjacent residential scheme.
Thank you. And then just the third point from the previous explanation that you gave, and you mentioned the hard unreserved edge on the eastern part of the site and western part of the settlement. And of course, that's something that Mr. Dudley has also very reasonably pointed out. But would you accept as a matter of general principle that that could be resolved by good land management, and you don't necessarily need to place 75 houses to resolve that edge?
That's a potential theoretical, but it hasn't happened to date. There's no evidence to suggest that that would come forward in the future. And the situation that we find currently with regard to that edge has persisted for some considerable time, with no resolution to that issue.
Thank you. Right. So I think we can probably move away from looking just at the site so closely. And you mentioned there the planning context and the fact that this may have been a preferred site. So I just want to take you to one aspect of that. In your proof, you deal with this at paragraph 3.2 of your proof.
Yeah, can I just turn that up, please?
This is where you refer to the 2010 landscape capacity study site options.
Just bear with me a minute.
Absolutely.
Could you give me the reference again?
Yes, it's page 8 and 9 of your proof. It starts at paragraph 3.2.
Oh. Yes, I have 3.2.
Thank you.
The capacity study.
Yes, and this is where you set out at paragraph 3.5 that a part of this site, or rather there's a site reference in the capacity study with the reference OV006, which overlaps with this site as you've set out in your figure 4.
Yes.
Yes, and again, as you've set out in your summary here of that study, that this site has a medium/high capacity in terms of being able to accommodate development. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes, and just to confirm, while we're looking at your figure 4, the actual extent of OV006 is just the northern 60% of the site, of the appeal site.
Yes, that's correct, yes.
And as we've seen from the parameters plan already, the majority of the houses in this scheme are in fact going to be sited on the southern portion of the site, which isn't quite captured by OV006. That's correct, isn't it?
It is correct, but it is captured by the identified site K in CD 3.9, my figure 5.
And yes, and that's the neighbourhood development plan process that led to it as a potential reserve site, yes. But just finishing off on this 006 reference, I just want to pick up what you say at paragraph 3.6. And at 3.6, I think the report which you're referring to acknowledges that the site forms part of the skyline in views from the north, and that there are panoramic views of the site towards the north. So
yes,
do you accept that as...
It does say that, yes.
Yes. And it would be fair for me to say, surely, that any bit south of that OV006 site, because it's obviously a little more elevated, would also form part of the skyline and views. So any houses placed on that would, of course, form part of the skyline, wouldn't it?
The southern part of the site would be comparable to any development located in the southern part of 006. So if I rephrase that, if you look at 006 and look at the southern part, the topographic levels of that is similar to the land which rises slightly south of that. So it would be comparable, yes.
Okay, so at the very least, it will...
Southern part. It'd be comparable to the southern part of 006.
Right, so then on your analysis, and at the very least, any houses placed on the southern part of this appeal site will form part of the skyline and views from the north, and there will be panoramic views towards the north, by reference to this report.
In broad terms, you would think that that would be the case. And clearly there are, first of all, in terms of panoramic views to the north, from the site itself, you can stand on the site and you can, particularly in the northern part of the site, you do get panoramic views northwards towards the north. The question is, in terms of looking back, and this was a point discussed with Mr. Dudley, but looking back from that panoramic, from the north, from the land to the north, which is the high ground of the A and B, as you look back, because you've got mature tree cover immediately flanking the northern boundary of the site and any housing situated within the site would lie in the shadow, the visual shadow of that mature tree cover, and housing that frames the northern side of the site. So in theory, logic would suggest, yes, that is technically correct. But the reality is, when you're on that northern ground looking back, I've been to those viewpoints, which are referenced in my proof. It's very, very difficult to actually work out where the site is, because there is so much tree cover on the rising slopes towards that site. So it is heavily framed by tree cover. And so the view back is really very, very much curtailed and limited.
Thank you. So I won't repeat the point to you, because I do think you accepted that it was technically correct. And again, when we come back to the experiential views, in broad terms, that'll be for the inspector.
I would invite the inspector to go to those viewpoints, 20, I think it's 21, 2, 3 and 4 in the OMB.
Now, the reason for refusal, and just to use Mr. Boyle's shorthand, we can break up into the landscape side and the visual impact side. So I'm going to start with landscape, as you have done. But before moving on to individual elements on the site, I actually want to turn to landscape character of the broader area first.
Yeah.
And as you've already acknowledged, it's correct, isn't it, that we sort of are informed by reference to local character assessments.
Clearly, it's right to take those into account. Yes.
Yes, and why we would. while we will get on to the individual elements of the site, sorry, in due course, would you agree that once you've taken into account sort of the local landscape character and the key characteristics, that analysis feeds through or should feed through into how you value individual elements on the site?
Yes, it's part and parcel of that analysis, isn't it? Yes, it's one factor.
Yes, thank you. So this is set out in your section 7, and I think you begin quite reasonably with the national level assessment. But just on that, would it be fair to say that a 75 home scheme couldn't possibly affect a national character area?
Couldn't possibly affect. It would have a negligible effect upon the scale of the NCA 130. Yes.
Yes, so I think we're in agreement on that. So I'm not going to concern myself with that, but I'll jump to the more sort of granular assessments that we have.
Yeah.
And I want to pick up the county level one, the Hampshire County Integrated Character Assessment first. And it's common ground really that the site falls within 2 different designations there. So there's the Test Valley LCA 3B, and there's also part of the site which is in Hannington and Dummer Downs, which is reference 7B. Okay, so can I pick up the Hannington and Dummer Downs character reference, local character assessment, and this is Appendix 3 of your proof.
Yes, I have that now. Yeah, yes.
Thank you. Madam, do you have that as well? So we find key characteristics at page 2 of the electronic version and possibly of the... Sorry, at page 3, section 2.
Yes, section 2. Yes, I have those.
So towards the bottom of the page.
Yeah, I have those. Yeah.
And so I just picking up on some of these key characteristics. The first one says high elevated open chalk plateau covered by thick continuous clay and giving rise to gently undulating topography. Do you accept that this sort of plateau combined with gently undulating topography is representative or a feature of this site?
It is a feature of the site, and it's in terms of the profile there, in terms of being high elevated and chalk plateau, that would prevail with the scheme.
And then the next one is that there are large open arable farmlands enclosed with low hedgerows, trees and extensive woodland blocks. And again, this is a feature of this site, isn't it?
No, I wouldn't say that this site is reflective of that point. It's talking about large open arable farmland. And this isn't large scale, it's medium, small to medium scale, so it's not reflective of that point. If you, Madam, if you just go forward to internal page 1 of that document, go forward 2 pages, you can see that the top image there shows the large scale character due to field. So when it says large open arable farmland, that's the nature of the character of this area.
Sorry, can I just check which place you've taken me to?
Yes, sorry. If you go back towards the front of the document, so it's the first page in my appendices, internal page 1.
Yeah.
You'll see the title 7B, Hannington.
Yes, I've got that.
Okay, and it's that large photo image, which is the top half of the, and it says underneath, large scale character is due to field, and then it carries on. But that, when it's referring to that second bullet point I was just taken to, that's the characteristic of this area. The site is atypical of that.
Mr. Cook, so just looking at page 1 where you showed us what large scale character should look like, isn't it right that's just one example? So when you look at the smaller photos, there's a reference there to North Waltham, and it says that's also an example of large scale fields and woodlands.
Yes, it is. But it says, but that's again very typical. It's open, arable farmland, and those two views are comparable. They don't reflect what we found with the site. The site is small to medium scale and enclosed.
So then the the fifth bullet point there is about varying intervisibility due to areas of extensive semi-natural woodland lochs. And again, this you would accept, isn't it, a feature of this site as well?
No. This is saying varying intervisibility. So that suggests that you've got long, medium, short range intervisibility. And we've seen from
believe that that's the case on this site from views from the settlement, for example?
Well, the evidence is that the best views of this site are really from the adjacent residential areas. That's 7 acres and Pond Close, the residential area. We get that one view we've referred to, which is my viewpoint 7, viewpoint 6. But you don't really see much of the site itself. The vast majority of the site is behind that other side of the hedge. So the site is significantly enclosed and its visual containment is significant. And views of the site and what you see of the development is close range and short distance. So it doesn't, the site as it stands at the moment benefits from significant visual containment, short range views, not varying intervisibility as suggested here. You might have views out of the site looking north towards the AONB high ground to the north, but there isn't that view back of the site because it can't be appreciated. So there isn't that intervisibility.
And we will come on to visual impacts, but your own view, isn't it, that you actually do get lots of glimpses of the site from the settlement to the east, so from Pond Close, 7 acres, and
yes,
I think from Bolton Close as well.
Yes, that's right. But it's talking about varying intervisibility. So my interpretation of varying intervisibility, it's got to be talking about range. So that's got to be short, medium, and long term. Sorry, short, medium, and long range. And that's not the case here. There are only short range views.
And then
and some one-way long views across the Test Valley to the north.
The second to last bullet point then is about intricate network of narrow winding lanes.
Yes.
Do you believe that the sunken lanes, for example, on the west and north of the site are characteristic of this network of narrow winding lanes?
They're a characteristic of part of this where it says narrow lanes, but this is saying narrow winding lanes. These are geometric, but I accept that they're narrow lanes. They're sunken lanes. This is talking about narrow winding lanes, as in highway roads, which are sinuous, narrow, single track. We're familiar with those single track lanes with hedges either side, meandering through the countryside, reflecting the relief. That's what this is referring to. What we have immediately adjacent to the site are geometric sunken lanes, which are a different feature, really.
And just while we're on this document,
they're not on the site as well. They're off-site.
Yes. So just looking then to the threats that are identified in this character assessment, and that's page 11 of this document.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I have that. Opportunities?
No, the threats before we get to opportunities.
Yes, so I have that.
And just in terms of the threats, this character assessment identifies recent development and incremental change affecting the form and settings of villages and resulting in a loss of local distinctiveness. And then in the next sentence, it specifically mentions Basingstoke and Overton, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
And so as a matter of fact, this document identifies expansion proposed in Overton as a threat to this local character area.
That's what's documented here, yes.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to...
Could I just qualify the point?
Absolutely.
if I may, it's identifying a potential threat. It's identified as a threat. It doesn't mean that it's happened. So it's identifying that, but then it's going on to identify the opportunities. And what I would note is that if you look at the opportunities, it sets out a whole raft of measures that can be introduced, and the scheme has taken those on board. But the other point is that where you first took me to in that first line, where it's referring to the potential threat resulting in the loss of local distinctiveness. From the analysis I've just been providing in your earlier questions, there isn't anything regarding the site that defines it as being of local distinctiveness. There isn't anything that is particularly distinctive about the two arable fields. It's an everyday, workaday landscape in terms of those two arable fields. There's nothing. So if the scheme were to come forward in the form of what is proposed, compliant with the parameters plan, it wouldn't result in the loss of any local distinctiveness. Quite the contrary, the GI would reinforce some of the characteristics of the local landscape that are identified here.
So your view, of course, is that there's nothing distinctive about these fields, but if the inspector took the view that these fields were representative and the site is representative of the local character assessments, whether that's at the county level or local level, surely that is something that she should be taking into account when considering the loss of the character and the impacts.
Yes, it's absolutely right to consider the character of the site, and that has to be judged against what is seen locally, and whether there is anything that is particularly related to the site that is of local distinctiveness. That takes you to this point on local distinctiveness.
Yes.
And to what degree is the site typical or atypical of what is found locally?
Yes,
and
absolutely.
This, in my mind, is not locally distinctive and is an everyday landscape and reads as an urban fringe environment.
Yes, and you have said that a few times, but just to confirm for the inspector's note, if the inspector finds that it is representative of a local character assessment and that the site itself is a feature of the local character assessment, surely that can be part of its distinctiveness. It doesn't have to, in and of itself, produce its own distinctive qualities that are completely different from the local character assessment, for example.
Well, this is talking about threats, isn't it? In 236, you took me to threats, and it's talking about loss of local distinctiveness. So I see representativeness and local distinctiveness. You can slightly differentiate between them, but I would agree that clearly the inspector needs to take a view on whether, when she looks at the character of this site in light of the analysis, she comes to a view whether there are any particular redeeming features associated with the site that would take her to this point about local distinctiveness and how truly representative it is of the wider landscape. This is urban fringe.
Yeah, sorry, I rather ambitiously closed down Appendix 3 with my last question, but bring it back again. Yes, just to clarify, Mr. Cook, I did put that local distinctiveness point to you, but in fact, one of the points in threats is that it affects the form and setting of villages, and then also as a general threat, there is the expansion proposed in Downs just outside the character area in Overton.
Yes, so 2 points on that. 2 points on that, if I may. In terms of the form, it was agreed in cross-examination with Mr. Dudley. He confirmed that in terms of the form, when he was taken to look at the grain analysis of the settlement as the baseline, and then the grain analysis with the scheme in place, there was no material difference in terms of it wasn't out of character, it was in character. And secondly, in terms of the setting, the council don't produce any evidence in Mr. Dudley's proof with regard to the setting of the village as to how the site contributes to the setting of the village. What Mr. Dudley did in terms of his evidence looked at the setting of the site, which is different.
Well, perhaps it's a good place to pick it up then. Would you accept that the site itself forms the western setting of the village?
The site is part of the setting, and that is defined by that. Do you recall the plan I went to in evidence in chief, which identified the fine blue dot, the fine brown dots, in terms of the council's evidence base? But the extent to which you're able to appreciate and perceive the site contributing to the setting, landscape setting of the village, is extremely limited.
Well, the inspector will be able to take a view of that when she walks through some of the bits right to the east, the eastern boundary of the village. But you accept, at least as a matter of fact, that the site itself forms part of the western setting of the village.
It does, and that's what I've assessed, which is different to Mr. Dudley, who's assessed the setting of the site rather than the setting of the village.
Well, I think we'll probably disagree on what Mr. Dudley's has assessed, and that will be a matter for submissions. But coming on to the setting of the site, which I accept that Mr. Dudley has also additionally assessed, do you accept then that as a matter of judgment, many features that form the setting of the appeal site can in fact also form the setting of the village?
Potentially they could overlap and,
yes,
and be, yes, effectively overlap.
Yes, thank you.
But that degree of overlap is quite limited.
And that the degree of overlap and what in fact is a setting will of course be a matter for planning judgment, won't it?
Sorry, is setting a matter for planning judgment?
What constitutes the setting of the village?
No, I would say that's more of a landscape judgment. I mean, setting, you're talking about, setting has to be capable of being appreciated, and essentially so if it's going to be appreciated, it's got to be seen.
Sorry, Mr. Cook, I didn't mean planning judgment. I did mean landscape judgment.
Oh,
yeah, sorry, my mistake.
I think it falls squarely in the landscape domain.
See, I think we're on agreement then that this is a matter of landscape judgment, and as you've said, that there will be a degree of overlap, and the extent to which you, Mr. Dudley, disagree on which bits form part of the setting and which bits don't can be a matter of submissions.
Yeah.
Then let's leave behind Appendix 3, not least because I've closed it down again, and move on to your Appendix 5, which is the local landscape character assessment. This is the 2021 Basingstoke and Dean one, which I think you were just referencing a minute ago.
Yes, I was referring to the plan, wasn't I?
Yes.
Figure 13.
So I want to start here again. Firstly, in terms of common ground, we are, of course, talking about the South Test Down portion, which is reference 13.
You repeat the question. Sorry.
Yes, this site falls within reference 13, which is the South Test Down characteristic or landscape.
And that just re-emphasises the point I made earlier about that this reads more related to the plateau. Downland is plateau. So the clue's in the name.
And at page 104, we have key characteristics. That's internal page 104, but madam, it's page 9 of the electronic version.
I've got that. Key characteristics.
Now, the first one.
Forgive me, just we're on Appendix 5.
Yes.
My page numbers on Appendix 5 start at 22.
Yes, and they should jump on.
Madam, if you look at electronic at the top of PDF, if you go to page 9, that should bring you to the right one. internal page number is 104 of the total assessment.
Okay, I'm there.
Thank you. So if we just pick out some of these characteristics again, I just want to get your views on whether you think they're representative or not. So the first one is the rolling chalkland. And again, speaking of gently undulating topography, would you accept that this is a feature of the site?
It is the rolling chalkland, that's the base substrate. And there is a little bit of gentle topography across the site that we've talked about. Yes.
Thank you. And then the fourth bullet point is large open arable fields. Now, would you accept that this site is representative of that characteristic?
No, it's the same point I made earlier when I was referring to the photo views with respect. And it does say, it goes on to say open. It qualifies it as well in terms of arable fields. They aren't any arable fields, they're open arable fields. They're open. They're open because it says bounded by low, insignificant hedgerows, infrequent woodland blocks. Okay, so when you go, if you think back to the photograph I took the inspector to, it's very clear that it's open and expansive in terms of the character and appearance of those fields. That's not the case with regard to the site. The site's atypical of that.
The southern boundary, isn't it an insignificant and partial hedgerow? That's exactly what we saw on the site.
No, not at all. You can see the degree to which it is providing containment, because if you ask yourself the question, how much of the two fields can you see with that hedge in place? It's very limited, isn't it? So it must by definition fall that it has a containing effect.
Okay, so we clearly have your view that these fields aren't open and so therefore don't fall within this key characteristic. But actually, Mr. Dudley's evidence, and in fact the evidence of, the written evidence of terra firma, the appellant's original consultants, both do give weight to the openness of the site. So if the inspector accepts their evidence in openness, then you would agree that removing or the loss of these two fields would be something that would effectively be a loss of this key characteristic.
If that was found to be the case, that this is open and was open and expansive, but I maintain that in terms of the site, it's enclosed. And just going back to, for the inspector's benefit, if you were to look at viewpoint 6 in my appendix 20, just check, viewpoint, sorry, 22, that I referred to earlier, you can't really appreciate the nature of that arable field because of the containing effect of that hedgerow along the southern part of the site, even though it is gappy. What you can see is hedge, gappiness, and then housing beyond, but you can't appreciate the field really.
And then I'm going to take you to the bullet point about 3 or 4 lower down.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, sorry, before we get there, there's also the next bullet point just after the large open arable fields, which are the semi-enclosed arable land feature.
Yes.
So if, in your view, would you say that the site is more representative of the semi-enclosed arable land as opposed to the large open arable field?
Well, you have to read on because it's that. So you're reading part of the character description. It says semi-enclosed arable land in the centre of the area between Brickkiln Wood and Leverstoke Wood, with more wood.
Quite right. That's not relevant.
Specifically referring to somewhere completely different to the site, and that is a very typical. That's a very specific point with regard to this South Test down landscape character.
You're absolutely right, Mr. Cook. So then just going back to what I was originally taking you to, which is generally higher intervisibility within the area, you've already given your views and you don't think that there is intervisibility.
No, I'm saying that I've qualified it, haven't I, in the way I have, but there is some, but it benefits from a significant degree of visual containment. But there are views out to the north, but not views back. So visibility is one way, not indivisible both ways from that area to the north, but essentially significant visual containment.
Thank you. And then just the third to last bullet point, which talks about specific areas to the western end of the character area, which we're not concerned with. And then it says, elsewhere, however, public rights of way cover considerable distances where large-scale landscape with limited detracting influences provide walkers with a peaceful sense of remoteness. And again, just I want to get your views. Do you think that the sunken lanes, for example, are representative of this or not?
Well, it's I think it's the sunken lanes have some degree of tranquility associated with them, but you walk those in the aware that you're close to the settlement of Overton, because and you get glimpse views of Overton. And that photo view 6 that I took you to is one example of that. So when we're talking about tranquility, just let me just read the wording. Large scale landscape limiting detracting influences. So this is really talking about just general built form. And it's also talking about a sense of remoteness. So it's suggesting that you're away from visual influences and it's remote. I wouldn't say that the two sunken lanes adjacent to the site have a sense of remoteness on this point, because, as I say, if you go to the viewpoint 6 I was just referring to, you've got a clear view of your proximity to the settlement. So the sense of remoteness is quite limited. And as you get further away, it increases.
And just thinking about the sort of as you say, the absence of remoteness, it's correct, isn't it, that with this build development, with this scheme, you will effectively be bringing houses up to about 45 meters of the sunken lane. So you'll be bringing it pretty adjacent to the western sunken lane.
I would say that clearly, as proposed in the parameters plan, that the housing would extend westward, but it's sufficiently set back into the site with that 45-50 meter separation distance between the lane, such that the proposed housing will not materially change the tranquility profile associated with that sunken lane. And the other point to note is that where you do gain a view of the proposed scheme, you see a similar view at the moment. So again, if you look at viewpoint 6, if I was to ask the inspector to look at viewpoint 6 and turn that up, you can see the existing residential area of 7 acres behind the vegetation in the southern part of the site. And so the settlement at Overton is perceived as lying, in terms of planes in the landscape, madam, it's behind that existing hedgerow. And what is proposed would again equally sit behind that hedgerow. And then you've got to factor in the landscape planting proposals that are integrated into the parameters plan, and that a substantial swathe of planting is proposed along that southern part of the site. So you'd see some housing in those odd views, but you'd see it use the general composition of that view is not going to materially change. The character of the view is not going to materially change.
So you've said that you can see sort of some of the 7 acres dwellings in the background, but as a matter of fact, you have said, haven't you, that along that western edge of the settlement, that actually has a very strong I think you've called it a strong, significant, rather urbanizing influence on the site.
The eastern side has, because there's such a
Yes,
lack of vegetation between the existing edge of the settlement and the site on the eastern side. Yes.
Yes,
But,
and so by placing the just let me finish my question, please. By bringing settlement, by bringing houses within 45 meters off the western sunken lane and onto these fields, do you not accept that as a matter of fact you are then bringing out to the west this urbanizing significant influence that you're then bringing out onto the sunken lanes?
No, because the difference is an important one, because there isn't much green infrastructure between the existing western boundary of the settlement and the eastern side of the site. So there is a strong urbanizing influence there. When you look at the landscape corridor and setback that is proposed, and the strategic planting as part of the parameters plan proposed, with that setback, the existing mature vegetation associated with the sunken lanes, the extra additional planting, the setback and the green spaces between, that will not lead to the same sort of urbanizing influences that are currently experienced with regard to the existing urban edge.
But all of that green planting, and I think it's some allotments that are proposed, at least in the indicative master plan, all of that you accept, don't you, that this will all be in a residential context. So at all times, there will be sort of residential use going on alongside the western sunken lane.
But the residential use is set significantly back into the site, isn't it? It's not just cheap by Jowl adjacent to the sunken lane. It's set by your distance of 45, my estimate of 50 meters eastward. So that is a considerable distance.
I'm not speaking now about the houses themselves. I'm just saying what you've proposed along that western edge, which I think, I might be wrong, but I think you've proposed some allotments there. And all I'm asking is that these allotments and that planting will all be still seen in very much a residential context, won't it? This is just going off your illustrative master plan, which is Appendix 12.
Yes, but as we said at the outset and was picked up with Mr. Dudley, you have to rely on it's the parameters plan, isn't it? We have an illustrative master plan, and in terms of the detail, that can be worked up through an RMA. But when you look at the parameters plan doesn't specify that you necessarily have the allotments on the western side of the site. That parameters plan identifies a broad swathe of green space, but what it does identify is strategic planting around the perimeter of it on that western boundary. So if the inspector took the view that the scheme was otherwise acceptable apart from the location of those growing areas and allotments, that is something that is totally within the gift of the council to be able to control through management of the application and conditions associated with it, I would have thought.
So on the landscape character assessment that we've been looking at, Appendix 5, can I just finish off by taking you to the last page of the I think it's the last page of the electronic document. Forgive me, I might have lost my page reference. It's actually page 10 of the electronic document, madam.
Are we in the same character?
So which electronic document?
Sorry, Appendix 5, the local landscape character assessment.
Is there an internal page?
Yes, it's actually, if we look at internal page 104 and 5, and
yes,
electronic page 9. Sorry, that's where we have been looking.
Yeah, that's where we were, wasn't it? Or
yes. If we scroll down to the next page, that's internal page 164 and 165. And Mr. Cook, that has your figure 13, which is Overton landscape setting and settlement character.
Yes, that's right.
And to the...
Sorry, my page references, we're in Appendix 5 now.
Yes, and it's electronic page 10.
Yeah. Okay. 164, 165. Got it. Thanks.
Thank you. And so we don't have what precedes it, but as I understand, this is where the document looks specifically at Overton. That's correct, isn't it, Mr. Cook? Because I haven't gone back to the main one. Yeah. And what we see next to figure 13 on the left-hand side, which is on page 164, that is a description of the western setting and edge of Overton specifically, isn't it?
Well, it's the setting to the whole settlement, not just the western setting to the village.
Well, I think that it specifically says at the top, it's the western setting and edge.
Oh, you're talking, I thought you were talking about the figure. Yes, there is that, there is that heading. Yes. Yes. I've got the text, sorry.
Yes, and it's a very small point, but it just says there, the western setting of the settlement is defined by the valley sides, including steep slopes to the south and relatively wide. Enclosed valley floor, which through landform and high tree cover and lower valley slopes contains views in and out of the settlement.
It does say that, yes.
Yes, and that covers some of the points that you were making about what you think the views are. Yes. But it also confirms that what we have on the immediate western setting is in fact the valley sides, and that is where we're proposing to put this scheme.
Well, as I would agree, but accepting the fact that it also runs into an area which reads more as the plateau, the chalk plateau.
Yes.
Which that part of Overton clearly sits. And it does emphasise the point, as you rightly referred to, contains views in and out of the settlement. So where it's talking about the settlement, and it's talking about views in and out of the settlement, so that's intervisibility. It's talking about the western setting, and we can see that from this figure 13. So what it's clearly doing is identifying that there's strong intervisibility between the settlement and the landscape immediately to the west of it.
Yes, so in fact, the Beale side, which is immediately to the west, forms an important backdrop to the views after the settlement.
It doesn't say important backdrop, it just says in and views in and out. So it's emphasising the intervisibility, which is the point I'm making. There is strong intervisibility, and that's the reason why you're getting these strong urbanising influences that characterise the site.
Okay, thank you for that. We can now push away this assessment. And before we move on, I just want to take a quick look at what you say in your proof in terms of these local character areas that we've just looked at.
Yeah.
And if we start at page 49.
In my proof?
Yes, please. Sorry, at page 48 is where you set out local level Hampshire County integrated character assessment. At page 49, you describe the key characteristics of the Test Valley Landscape 3B, which I didn't take you to. But what you say there in your overall assessment at paragraph 7.13 is that you consider these characteristics would continue to remain and prevail with the proposed scheme in place. The scheme would incur the loss of 2 arable fields. However, the characteristics would be reinforced with new planting at the site level. At the scale of the LCA scheme would have a negligible effect in terms of magnitude, etc. So just to confirm there, and in the following paragraphs, you don't actually specifically analyze how the building of 75 homes here would impact on the loss or otherwise of the LCA characteristics. That's correct, isn't it? Because you've just focused on the new planting and the loss of arable fields.
No, not at all. What I've done is I've identified the key characteristics, which is the right thing to do. Judged how the scheme would have a bearing upon that, bearing in mind that the scheme is the built form plus the green infrastructure. And I've concluded that all of these elements would continue to remain and prevail with the scheme in place. And that's correct. Because if you go through that checklist, I'm happy to do that if you want to take time to do so, but none of those are materially affected or harmed in any way by the proposed scheme if it were present on site. That you would still have this checklist of key characteristics as it is. It wouldn't change because there would be no effects off-site.
And then turning to the following page, at the bottom of page 50, you move on to character area 7B, Hannington and Dummer Downs, and you have provided, we've gone through in some detail your view of how whether or not it corresponds. But we again see your conclusion at paragraph 7.19 of your proof on page 51.
Yes.
And again, your assessment there is really exactly the same paragraph that you previously provided. And again, you mention exactly the loss of two arable fields and the reinforcement by new planting at site level, but you don't provide any analysis in terms of how the dwellings may or may not impact on the key characteristics there.
Well, because the only effect that the proposal has is that you're involving the removal of some partial arable field. There is no other material change in terms of affecting landscape elements or landscape character. Certainly landscape character offsite doesn't change. And I've identified in the earlier chapter how the site would be affected in terms of character on site.
Then moving on to the local level, which is the Appendix 5 that we were looking at, that starts at 7.24 of your proof on page 53.
Yes.
And on page 55, at paragraph 7.26, we get your overall analysis first. And again, you have the same paragraph there looking at the loss and the reinforcement by new planting, but we have your explanation on that. Yes, so I'll take that as the same.
I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that there's agreement between myself and Mr. Dudley on this point, in that in his evidence, in his proof, he doesn't evidence anywhere where any of these elements would be materially affected with regard to the character area. I don't see any evidence to that effect.
And that's certainly not how I have read his proof, but that can be a matter of submissions in any event.
But yes, I mean, as you took me to my paragraph 726 and onwards, that is my analysis, that these elements, when you draw them together, collectively define the character of the landscape which surrounds the site, and they would continue, they would remain. The proposal on site doesn't materially affect any of these defining characteristics. What it does involve is the loss of some arable, partial loss of an arable field, two arable fields, the introduction of housing which would be in keeping in terms of architectural design and character, scale and appearance, together with green infrastructure that's going to reinforce some of these defining elements. So they would either remain or, be enhanced.
Mr. Cook, thank you for that. So just turning then to your overall assessment, that sort of ties together all these strands, and some you've already addressed a lot of this. I don't want to go over the same territory. I note that you stress quite a bit in your assessment at paragraphs 7.39 and 7.40 about, well, maybe you don't say that, 740, sorry, but you talk about the significant urbanizing influence from the existing settlement. And we have actually covered already in my questions your view as to whether or not this extends westwards. I put to you that it clearly would, and your answer quite firmly has been that in your view it doesn't because of the planting. That's correct.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. So it won't take you over that, go over that again. But just before we finish here, because I know you mentioned settlement pattern at the end, can I just turn up Appendix 18, which looks at the historic evolution of the site?
Yes. Bear with me. Yes, there are a series of plans there, Madam. I hope you can get access to those reasonably well.
Yes, I have them.
Good.
Thank you. So if we look at the fourth plan, which is page 4, Madam, electronically, and we see there that that's, sorry, it's labeled Historic Evolution of the Settlement 1983 to 85. So Mr. Cook, just to confirm there, that's when you take the purple development and what's in black already, it's right, isn't it, for me to say that effectively everything we see on there in purple and in black has therefore been in existence since 1985 at least?
Sorry, what's in black?
The sort of settlements in black, the little houses and things.
So what this is doing is noting the change. So what is coloured with a sort of mauve tone on here, purple tone, is identifying the change that has occurred since 1961.
Yes, absolutely. So just
between 1961 and this period, 83 to 85, this is the areas that have developed as part of the growth of the settlement.
Yes. So just on that, what I was saying to you is that since at least 1985, because this plan talks about 1983 to 85, since at least 85, what we see here is that actually the western edge is, or the western boundary is quite a linear western boundary running up what we know to be the valley slope. That's correct, isn't it?
Running up the valley slope. Well, it cuts across the plateau and then starts to dip down into that dry valley in that northeastern corner.
Okay, so I think we're probably both saying the same thing there then. We see then from that plan that, well, actually, if we go to the next plan, it's even clearer. And that's the present day one. So we see that linear western boundary, but what we see in addition on the western edge is in fact the building out of 7 acres.
Yes.
And that's next to the playing field, the sports ground.
That's
and
right.
So would you agree then that the building out of 7 acres on that site was firstly in keeping with the western edge of the settlement?
Well, it follows the line southward, so it's southward extension, and it doesn't extend further west in that development.
And because of how it's very neatly tucked in between the development to its north and also the playing field to the east, it does in fact actually end up neatly rounding off this edge of the settlement.
When you say neatly rounding off, in terms of it sits to the south of existing development area at the time, and to the east it had the playing fields.
Yes. So the easiest way to look at whether or not it rounds off the settlement is really to flick between the previous map and this one, and you can see how it effectively fills in that gap and rounds off that edge, the western edge and the southern edge.
Yes, I would take issue with the word rounding off, because that's what I wouldn't necessarily refer to as sort of rounding off, because it's clear extension into countryside. If you look at the red area due east of that, on the other side of the road, you can see that there's you see how it's a bit like a hat with a flat southern bottom to it, straight line. See the area I'm referring to. That gives a better sense of, to use your phrase, rounding off, because that's taking a line from A to B from 2 existing points and the settlement edge, and then drawing a line and filling in between that line and the existing settlement. That's more rounding off, where I wouldn't describe 7 acres as rounding off. That's an extension into countryside, as is the case with this scheme.
Okay, thank you for that. I mean, that is interesting, because you do actually describe this proposal as rounding off of the village edge. So is that something you still stand by in light of what you've just said?
Yes, in terms of if you bearing in mind you've got that hard urban edge with around Pond Close, then this provides a way of actually introducing a residential area to provide a better edge and a better sort of resolution to the edge. So in that respect, it is providing a rounding off to the settlement in that context.
But Mr. Cook, you just a moment ago said you would describe rounding off as where you could connect 2 points of already existing settlement and just having sort of an infill there. That's clearly not what's happening here, isn't it? What you're having here is you're building out westwards and breaking the linear edge that you've had since 1985.
But there is a degree of rounding off associated with it, as I say, with regard to Pond Close. But I agree, it's an extension into countryside to the west, in the way that 7 acres extended further southwards.
All right. Okay. So, well, I've got what I understand to be your definition previously of rounding off, and just for your notes, Madam, the reference in the proof to this site being rounding off, a rounding off site is 11.3 in Mr. Cook's proof. And Mr. Cook, I don't know if you want to go to it and explain any further, or are you happy with what you've just said? 11.13 of your proof, in your summary.
13. Can you give me the whereabouts?
It's halfway through the paragraph where you talk about delivering significant enhancement with green infrastructure, high quality built environment with 7 acre scheme, consistent with 7 acre scheme, and would create an attractive rounding off for this urban edge of Overton.
An attractive rounding off. Yes. So what I'm referring to there is, so if you read, you've got to read the whole paragraph rather than in isolation. But what I'm talking about is setting the scene in terms of how you see the site at the moment as being an everyday landscape. It's got my point I've just made about the harsh urban edge to the east, strong urbanising influences. And then if you look at the proposal is going to deliver significant environmental enhancement in terms of the green infrastructure, along with the built form. And that would create an attractive rounding off and strong permanent landscape framework for this urban edge of Overton. So in that context, what I'm saying is, when you look at that parcel of land, which is the red line in relation to the existing settlement edge, it's providing some further residential neighbourhoods which would be contiguous with the existing residential neighbourhood, and then that would be framed to the southwest and to the north by substantive landscape framework, which is providing a strong rounding off to this quadrant of the settlement. So that is an appropriate description in those terms.
And just as a matter of fact, though, you accept that what the site does is that it breaks up the long-standing boundary and brings development westwards onto the valley slope.
It does, but you're just looking at it in plan form, which is a very, very dangerous thing that my planning colleagues do. And it's very important that you actually look at a site in the context of 3D and actually how it's perceived in the field. And looking at a plan is one thing, but when you look at this site in the context of the surrounding area and undertake that character and visual analysis, it is apparent that the site contributes little to the setting of the settlement of Overton, and it is visually well contained. So it's very important to look at it in the real world in 3D, because 3D is a very different situation to looking at something in plan form and saying, well, it just follows a straight line north-south, which on this plan, I agree, it does. But in reality, you need to look at it on the ground. Yes,
absolutely. And no doubt both sides are inviting the inspector to do exactly that. at the site visit.
Yes.
Right, so that does bring me to the end of landscape character assessments, and I am going to move on to your assessment of individual landscape elements on the site itself. And I'm very happy to go on, but I just wonder that if you did want to break, or Madam, if you felt you wanted to break, would this be an appropriate moment, or do you want me to continue to one and see how far we've got then? I'm sorry, Madam, you're on.
We can't hear you, Madam.
Right, turned it off rather than. I'm with you now. It very much depends on on how much time you think you're going to need to conclude your cross-examination, really. As to whether or not we take a break now or wait till the lunch session.
I don't think
break slightly later for lunch if you needed to.
I don't think I'll be able to finish before lunch or shortly after. I didn't. I know I said a shorter time estimate, but actually has taken a bit longer with some of the more fuller answers, which I fully appreciate Mr. Cook is entitled to give. So on that basis, I think I would probably need I would estimate around another 45 minutes at least, assuming that I will get full answers to the rest of the questions.
I mean, if you are content to take a break now, it's probably we take a 10-minute break now and then come back and try and finish your session and then stop for lunch. Would that be sensible, Mr. Cook? Would that?
Yes, I'm happy with what you suggest. That's fine.
I'm conscious not to give a very long break between within your cross-examination, but yeah, I'm content for a short comfort break now, given that we've been going an hour and 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
that makes sense.
If we come back at just after your 10 to 1. 10 to 1. And then we can finish cross-examination, then we'll break for lunch. That does mean that we'll have re-examination after lunch and any questions from me. So obviously the protocols in place for that need to be observed.
Yes.
So I'll adjourn now for until 10 to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam.
Hello. Hi, Miss Perec. Mr. Cook.
Hello. Hi.
Happy for you to continue, Miss Perec, when you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cook. As I said, we could move away from local character assessments, and I'm now moving on to where you have assessed the site itself, and you've picked out a number of elements on the site and sort of assessed each one. Now, as we've discussed at the outset, the original LBIA in this case was prepared by Terra Pharma, and presumably, although you might not be able to say this, your client was, of course, happy to sign off on the conclusions that Terra Pharma reached in its original LBIA. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, that's my understanding, yes.
Yes. And I think you very candidly accept at the start of your proof, paragraph 2.10, that you disagree with this original LBIA on the nature of landscape effects.
Yes, yes.
I just want to look at paragraph 2.10 because
proof.
Yes, please. And it's towards the end of that paragraph where you're explaining the difference of views, and it's on page 4.
Yes.
And it says you set out that effectively you disagree with the original LBIA in terms of nature of effects. Because they think it's adverse and you think it's neutral to beneficial. But then you say, I would note that it needs to be borne in mind that this assessment that I've undertaken was against a baseline situation of the previous Bargate home scheme being in place adjacent to the site. Now, I just want to check there. Are you implying that Terra Pharma did not actually take into account the 7 acres development when they came to their conclusions?
Can you take me to the reference again in my proof where you were just quoting from my proof?
Yes, it's paragraph 2.10, which starts on page 3.
Yes, I have that.
But it's right at the end of that paragraph, which I see on page 4.
Undertaken against the baseline situation of Bargate. Yes, it's right that the baseline situation is taken into account.
Yes, so what I'm asking is, obviously you have done that, but are you implying there that the reason that you've come to different conclusions is because Terra Pharma have not?
I'm just confirming that I have taken the Bargate scheme into account.
That's very helpful, thank you.
If you look at some of, sorry, just to qualify, if you look at some of the mapping, as we've been looking at, clearly the mapping doesn't capture. So it's potentially, it could give the impression that that 7 acres isn't taken into account.
Right, so you're just clarifying.
But we had those sort of misleading references in Mr. Dudley's proof, if you recall as well, that it was under construction, etc.
So I'm just checking there then. You're agreed, aren't you, though, that Terra Pharma did also include the 7 acres development in its baseline? I
would have to check and look it up. I can't recall.
I can give you the references now, if that's helpful. This is their LBIA, which is core document. So I'm just finding the reference. I'm looking at the wrong thing. Well, it's core document 1.9, but it's split up at least electronically into 3 different parts.
Yeah, for some reason my old doc started at 110. I'd have to find a hard copy of it now.
Madam, if I can, if you've got them electronically, at least my 1.9 are split into 3 parts, and I'm not sure if yours are, but if I can ask you to look at what is effectively labeled volume 1, part 1 for me. Do you have that?
Can I just check with you? Have you got dated June 2020?
Yes, that's the date, June 2020. And that's their first report.
I've done 3.
Madam, do you have that as well? You're on mute, sorry.
I'm just struggling to find that at the minute. Sorry, I was looking in this direction, not realising the mute button was on. I haven't got it to hand at the moment because it's.
If it helps, I can confirm. Yes, it does take the 7 acres bargate scheme into account.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. That's really helpful. So, Madam,
I've got the reference.
Yes, and that the 7 acre site is very much part of the terra firma baseline as well. So I needn't give you multiple page references where that's evidenced. That being said, Madam, I was intending to turn this up again later on, so it might be something that we will need in due course.
Okay.
Right, but we have established then that both you and terra firma used the same baseline, but of course you have come to different conclusions.
Yes.
And you obviously can't speak for terra firma, so I'm just going to focus on your conclusions that you have reached, and starting then with topography. Sorry, so this is section 6 of your proof and page 39.
Just let me. Page 39, did you say?
Yes.
Yes, I have that.
Yeah, so you've assessed topography there.
Yes.
And I just want to circle back to something that we've already discussed, but we have accepted, well, you have technically accepted your own LVIA, which is that the site is on itself has a northerly aspect, which is what you've said in your LVIA.
Yes.
And we also know that it is gently undulating topography because it undulates that way from 120 down to 105. And you have also accepted, haven't you, that rolling topography is a key characteristic of the, for example, the wider South Test down LCA. We looked at it as a key characteristic in a number of local character assessments, didn't we?
Yes.
Yes. And so you accept that when you're assessing, for example, the value of topography, you would factor into account, you would take this into account when you're assessing what value to give the site. So for example, whether it contributes to a local character assessment or if it has particular features of the local character assessment.
Yes, to a degree, it would be one consideration.
Yes, but your view here is that the value, notwithstanding that it has this feature, is in fact low in terms of value of the topography. Yeah,
there's nothing remarkable or significant about it. It shares topographic continuity with the adjacent residential area.
And the fact that it's on a valley slope, looking out northwards, and has expansive views, which you have accepted, at least looking out northwards, you don't think that that merits anything greater than low value?
No, because at the end of the day, the topography is very subtle within the site, and it can only be appreciated on the site. You can't appreciate the topography of the site beyond the site. In fact, you can't really appreciate the site, period, beyond the site, beyond the immediate environs of the site. Say, maybe looking in from the adjacent residential area, 7 acres, or from Pond Close, from the end of the road there, where it abuts the site. But appreciation and understanding and legibility and understanding of the legibility of the topographic profile of the site, limited to the site and can't be really appreciated beyond that.
Right, thank you. So then moving on to your next element, which is trees and hedgerows.
Yes.
You stated paragraph 6.4 that you consider this resource to be high overall value and high susceptibility. And
yes.
Then you say overall sensitivity is considered to be medium. But by your own analysis of high and high, if you use your own methodology, doesn't that lead to a high sensitivity?
Yes, if you blend value and susceptibility, yes, that would be correct. But then you've got to look at the actual quality of the tree cover as well, and it isn't particularly significant. So I've rounded that to medium, but yes, I'm quite happy to accept that's medium high.
Mr. Cook, let's just take a look at your own, what you say yourself in your LVIA about methodology. So it's your Appendix 9. And it's page 36 electronically, madam, of Appendix 9. And Mr. Cook, for your reference, it's your table 1 in one of your appendices. I'm not sure it's an appendix, it's
yes,
it's your methodology section. And
yes, yes, I have that. That's, yeah, I have that.
So you yourself have set out how you calculate sensitivity, or how you come to an assessment of sensitivity by using the standard guidance in Glivia. And if you look at your own table, what you get is if you combine high and high, you get high.
Yes, that's right. Yes. In terms of overall sensitivity, that's value and susceptibility. Yes.
Yes. So if we were applying that to your judgment of high overall value and high susceptibility, what we should actually get in terms of sensitivity is high, isn't it?
Yes, I'm happy to accept that as high. Yes.
Okay, and actually,
it doesn't change the overall conclusions, in that when you accept that in terms of the magnitude of change, which is quite significant, it's high. Whether you have medium sensitivity or high sensitivity, when you blend that against a high magnitude of change with the extent of the proposed planting that's envisaged with the scheme, you're still going to end up with the same conclusion, that you have a major degree of effect, which I would maintain would be beneficial because of the introduction of the further planting.
Right. That may well be your view, Mr. Cook, but I was just trying to understand how you'd apply to your methodology.
That's the analysis. If you just follow it through, if you change that to high, it doesn't change the outcome.
Okay, but would it help actually, would it be any assistance if we look at what you actually say in your LVIA at paragraph 5.5, which is page 12, because actually just cross-referring to that, the text in the LVIA actually says medium value and medium susceptibility.
Yes.
So perhaps you did mean to get to medium after all.
Which paragraph?
5.5. So you say trees and hedgerows considered to be of medium value. And then in that same paragraph, you say medium susceptibility.
Yes, yes, I see that.
So when we then go back to your proof at 6.4, just so that we're clear, we should therefore be saying it has medium value, medium susceptibility, and we would still get to overall sensitivity of medium. So your original, what you had originally said. Yes,
and equally, I'm quite happy to say that it ranges between medium to high, but if you follow that analysis through in terms of a higher magnitude of change, you still end up with a major degree of effect.
Yeah, so you say high magnitude of change. Can I just again look at your methodology of how you assess magnitude of change, and that's table 6 in your appendix 9, where you provide the criteria for assessing magnitude of change on landscape character.
Yes, let me just turn that up. Yeah, got that.
Yes. So where, right, so you've got...
You're in the wrong table, I think. I think you're taking me to the wrong table. We're talking about landscape elements here. This is landscape character.
Sorry.
Table 5 is dealing with landscape elements for magnitude of change.
Yes. Sorry, so that is what I meant. And so you've got high, medium, low, negligible.
Negligible, yeah.
And what you said, well, so you said high magnitude, and high magnitude in table 5, one would get if you've got a substantial loss or gain of a landscape element.
Yes.
Now, what you've already accepted this morning is that the site is actually, one of the features of the site is that there is quite substantial mature tree coverage. Those were your words in at the start of our cross-examination, which now feels like many hours ago. But are you effectively saying that by removing some tree cover, because you accept that some tree cover needs to be removed, and then by adding some tree cover, that's actually a substantial gain and not just a partial and medium level gain?
The majority of the tree cover is off-site, isn't it? It's framed by the site, but the reality is that the substantial tree cover around the perimeter of the site is off-site. What actually falls within the site is very limited. What you've got is some root plates associated with adjacent vegetation. That's identified in the parameters plan. What the parameters plan does in terms of, if you look at it, in terms of identifying the significant trees, they're relatively limited. And what this proposal seeks to do in terms of the broad green infrastructure is introduce a significant amount of new planting. That would be a higher magnitude of change. This is basically a landscape that's devoid of any features internally within the site.
Right, then moving on to land use, which you assess in terms of it being an arable land use. At paragraph, this is back to your proof, Mr.
Yes.
Cook, and Madam, this is page 41 of the proof. So at 6.6, at the end of that paragraph, you come to the conclusion that in overall terms, this loss of the land, the arable fields, and creation of meadow would result in net beneficial effect. So you're saying that's going to be a beneficial effect by removing the arable fields and having some meadows and the 75 homes. But then when you look at paragraph 6.7, you talk about there being a moderate adverse effect and limited harm. Now, I'm just trying to understand how this can both be beneficial and harmful.
Okay, so in terms of paragraph 6.6, that's with regard to the site, and that's in terms of the wider area, paragraph 6.7. So it is a loss locally.
Okay, so ultimately there is harm locally, is what you conclude. Thank you. So moving on then to public rights of way.
Yes.
Your starting point is that this scheme would provide many new opportunities for the public to explore new areas on the western side of Overton that were previously.
Right. Can I just qualify, because I'm probably not giving you a full enough answer there, I don't think, if I may. So when I was talking in paragraph 6.6 at the bottom there, I'm talking about the creation of the wildflower meadow net beneficial effect. You see that?
Yes.
So it's creation of something new, which is the wildflower meadow. And in terms of the paragraph 6.7, that's regarding the loss of the arable field itself in terms of the arable area, which is local and limited to the confines of the site.
Right, so but we're concerned in terms of the elements that we're focused on in this part of your proof, the ultimate conclusion is the harm, isn't it? No.
I'm talking about the land use as well as arable.
Yes, and so your conclusion there is that there's an overall harm.
So you've got to take the two side by side. So you've got the benefit of the meadow being created and the adverse effect with the limited loss of the arable area with regard to the land use.
Right. I mean, perhaps it would help if I just, for my own purposes, bring up your table at the end. Which is, I think, Appendix 10 of your proof. Right, so just to confirm, by reference to your Appendix 10, where you summarize landscape elements and the effects on them, you actually do conclude that it's moderate adverse.
With regards, because I've qualified it in terms of land use being arable, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Forgive me, Ms. Pratt, the Appendix 10 I've got as the National Design Guide to Mr. Cook's proofs.
There are several sections to 10. It's 10A, summary of effect schedules, of which there are 3.
Right, 10A what? So I've got 10A1. Okay, thanks.
Yes,
10A1.
10A1 is where the land use arable is concluded to be moderate adverse harm. Madam, we probably will be flicking back to this table a bit, a fair bit in the section, so it'd be helpful to leave that open. Right, then moving on to public rights of way.
Yes.
I was just saying that your baseline there for assessing value, etc., is that the scheme would provide many new opportunities for members of the public to explore new areas on the western side of Overton that were previously not accessible. Now, Mr. Cook, is that actually sustainable? I mean, you yourself have said that there are a number of informal footpaths around the fields that are currently used to access the site. I know you've labelled that as tolerated trespass, but those clearly exist, don't they?
They do exist, but they're not appropriate to take into account because it's trespass, isn't it?
Right.
And if in terms of the management of that field, the landowner decided to put a fence around that field and signage accordingly, saying private keep out, be within his rights to do that without any recourse to planning. Private land.
And so if we put that aside,
you can't start ascribing rights to dog walking routes. You know,
but if you'd let me finish the question.
Come on.
So let's put aside the tolerated trespass, but it's still correct, isn't it, that there are routes all around that from the settlement that you could still access the northern and western sunken lanes. So you don't have to gush across this tolerated trespass to get to the western and northern lanes. You can walk around, and in fact that then leads on to many more circular routes.
Let me just think about that. So if you wanted to get onto the sunken lane to the west of the site, you could do that by means of the sunken lane at the northern part of the site, by that route, which is defined as the mud track. But if, say, you're a resident and you're living in 7 acres, and I'm just looking at my public rights of way. I'm just looking if it helps the inspector to turn up a plan. I've got my Appendix 13, which is the public rights of way plan. It might be useful to have that to hand, Madam, before I just explain.
Yes, I have that now.
So you can see the grey tone where 7 acres is, and you can see the public right-of-way network. So if you were there and you accept that the site is fenced off and you don't have access to that, and you want to get to Overton 26 to the west, you can see that if you go southeastwards towards the bridleway, which is Overton 14, you'd have to go down there, and that doesn't really lead you onto Overton 26. So your only way is to walk up through the residential area and then pick up the mud track. So it's a very long, tortuous route round to pick up that route. But the point I would make is that those routes suggest that there actually is a desire to get from residential area to the east to the sunken lane to the west. So there is a desire to get a connection between the two. What they're doing that unlawfully by means of going across private land. What this proposal would do is introduce that degree of connectivity in a way which would be much more appropriate as part of the green space.
Yes, Mr. Cook, and that probably is right if they want to cut across directly and straight away to the western sunken lane. But in fact, many walkers just probably walk to enjoy the countryside and to enjoy the many circular routes that are offered. Isn't that correct?
Yes, except in this particular area, there really aren't. Immediately around to the south of the settlement, those circular routes don't exist. They're due south routes, aren't they? North-south, and they don't connect east-westwards. But clearly those paths are there on site, and you can tell that they're used. So there's obviously heavy traffic heavy pedestrian traffic between the residential area to the east and that sunken lane to the west. By the fact there are those desire lines.
So you've used that as your baseline in assessing what value and sensitivity and so on to attribute. As part of this assessment, however, you haven't specifically considered the quality or tranquility of these lanes, have you?
In terms of when you say the lanes, the sunken lanes?
Yes, the sunken lanes.
Which are off-site?
Yes.
So we're moving away from the elements on site now?
Well, I mean, you're talking about public rights of way at 6.8, and there are no public rights of way in any event on the site. So I did very much assume that you were speaking both about the site and the accessibility to off-site routes.
Well, hopefully I was answering your question, but in terms of public rights of way, there aren't any on site. Tranquility is a separate point. With tranquility with regard to those sunken lanes, which are routeways which people can use, they're publicly accessible, they're off-site. There is no recreational provision on site at the moment other than that tolerated trespass, which I've just covered.
Right. Thank you. So then moving on to water features. Now you accept that there's no water features on site.
Yes.
And you prescribe medium sensitivity, and you don't explain how there, but when you look at your LVIA itself, Appendix 9, it's paragraph 5.10 of your Appendix 9 on page 14.
Yes, I have that there.
Yes, and the way you get to medium sensitivity is, as you explain at 5.10, it's because you say that the susceptibility and value of water features are assessed as medium. Now, I'm not quite clear on how you get to a value of medium for something that doesn't actually exist on site. So again, when you look at your table 2, which is criteria for assessing the value of landscape elements, can you just explain how you've ascribed a medium value to something that doesn't actually exist on site?
In terms of medium value?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's introducing a new feature, isn't it?
But that's when you get on to magnitude of change, isn't it? When you're looking at value, just looking at the value of what actually exists on site at the time.
But you're comparing, aren't you? You've got to look at the feature as a resource. It's
right. That's not my understanding of how you've assessed the other baselines in terms of value. You've certainly taken value as a start. You've assessed value based on the baseline existing as now. You've not considered it in the context of what you're introducing. That's certainly not the approach you took for topography, for example, or trees and hedgerows. So just on the water feature, there's no water feature. The starting point is that there's no water feature, but you've given it medium value. So would you accept that actually that should probably be low value?
No, I think it's appropriate to apply medium value in terms of introducing a feature. If you're going to that's the difficulty with the rigors of applying a matrices, which Glivia forewarns you in terms of providing narrative. But if you apply the table and the analysis, you've got to look at sensitivity, susceptibility value to get sensitivity blended with magnitude. What the magnitude is here is you're introducing some water features on site in terms of surface water balancing features.
Mr. Cook, that's about magnitude. I just asked you about value, which is the first page.
So you've got to, but if you're going to get a degree of effect, you've got to apply some sensitivity, haven't you?
But
how otherwise do you get a degree of effect? So
you can still start off with low. What's the point of having a low value? So are you saying in your assessments you never ascribe anything to have low value, because otherwise you wouldn't get your desired degree of effect?
No, not at all. I'm just saying that I think it's appropriate to ascribe a medium value to the feature in terms of this locality.
Okay, well, I think the inspector probably has both our points. Moving on then to your effect on landscape elements. And I think here you start to tie together a lot of what we've discussed. And you say at your, this is going back to your proof, sorry, it's at 6.10, page 43.
Yes.
And you say there that the main elements are hedgerows and trees. And that's very much, is it not fair that that is very much what is your sort of baseline for your assessment of how the site is going to be affected?
There are very few features associated with the site, so yes, those are the main elements, other than the arable field itself. Yes.
Well, that's your assessment. Others have assessed it differently. So Terra Firma, for example, assessed it on the basis of the openness, scale, pattern, character, for example.
Yes.
That's not something that fed into your assessment, is it?
It's collectively, by looking at the combination of these elements and looking at how they contribute to identify the character of the site, I've picked those elements up in my analysis.
But they don't feature as elements of the site because you don't consider them to be elements of the site, do you?
Yes, they're picked up in the general description of the site from 6.13 onwards in terms of my overall analysis, drawing all those threads together.
Well, no, I was asking you specifically about, for example, openness of the site, which is something that Terra Firma commented on and the council's expert commented on. That's not something that you consider to be a landscape element. You don't consider the site to be open.
It has more of a visual dimension in terms of openness.
Right. Well, in terms of your conclusion, in any event, at 6.12, you've tied all your threads together of the various features that we've looked at, or elements. And what you say there is that the scheme will result in major net beneficial effect.
Yes, in terms of the overall landscape elements. Yes, that collectively define the character of the site.
Okay, and so is it fair to summarize your view that in sort of the following way, which is that replacing these arable fields, which you don't consider to be open, with build development and with reinforced boundaries and some tree cover and planting is a major net beneficial in terms of landscape character?
At the site level, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
there is significant green infrastructure proposed with this scheme as part of the scheme. Yes.
Yes. And now, before we go on to look at your table, just to see how you've got to net beneficial, because obviously I think you only get to net beneficial if you add up all your individual elements to sort of consider them in the round. Yes. Before we get on to that, do you accept that all of these new landscape elements that you've discussed or give value or give emphasis to, they all will appear in a residential context?
They will be adjacent to a residential area, but the design of the green infrastructure would be naturalistic in character. So it would have a rural character to it. Even though it was adjacent to a residential area. In other words, it wouldn't have an urban character, like an urban park, for instance.
And what about residential character?
It would be adjacent to the two new residential areas. But the residential character would apply to the development area. The green infrastructure would be naturalistic and be more reflective of the rural character.
And just while we're on this part of your proof, and before we flip back to the table, my last question really was on paragraph 6.17 of your proof on page 44.
617, yes, got that.
And this is a point that we have explored before, so don't intend to go over that again, but you do say here there's a strong urbanizing influence, which you've said repeatedly, from the 7-acre scheme.
Yes.
So sorry, just to read exactly, it says, strong urbanizing influence associated with the 7-acre scheme. This contributes to create a sense that the site forms an urban fringe environment and is currently in a somewhat poor state of repair and intactness.
Yes.
Now, just to clarify that, are you suggesting that the poor state of repair and intactness has been brought on by how the 7 acres development has been finished off at that edge?
Separate point, unrelated. The state of repair and the intactness and condition of the site is completely irrelevant to the proximity of the 7 acres. It's just the fact that if a landscape, you look at it in terms of its intactness. So, for example, there is a north and a south field. And you can see on the plan that it's subdivided by a line, so that's a field boundary. But that hedgerow now is almost defunct. There's a little bit of scrub now in the middle of that site. So the original hedge has long since gone. So it's about intactness and condition.
Right. So just turning then, as I said, we were to your Appendix 10, Table 1.
Appendix 10, Table 1, yes, I have that.
Yes, and that's the summary of landscape elements effects. So it just puts in a very helpful table form what we've already discussed, and we're just looking concerned really with the degree of effects. And very helpfully, you have set out what terra firma have also concluded on each of these, and it shows the difference in opinion, in professional opinion, between the two of you.
Yeah.
So is it fair to say that this table, when you look through down the column of degree of effects, when you take all of that into account in terms of your assessments, that's how you get to net beneficial, major net beneficial?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay, so well, let's just look at that for a second. So with topography and trees, Mr. Cook, is it not simply just a case of double counting here, because actually you've assessed them as one and the same throughout?
Sorry, what have I double counted, you're suggesting?
Topography and trees, by separating them out into two different.
How can topography and trees be?
So I'm so sorry, trees and hedgerows.
Right.
Isn't that a case of double counting?
Well, they're completely different features, aren't they?
Well, it's just that in your.
If you saw a tree, you wouldn't say that was a hedge, and you wouldn't say a hedge is a tree.
I absolutely wouldn't. I'm just going by your own LVIA. So in your own LVIA, you deal with trees and hedgerows together, and you don't make a distinction in terms of value, etc. So I'm just surprised to see it separated out in that way.
Right. Okay, I understand.
Turning then to land use, that you've confirmed, haven't you, that you're just looking at it in terms of its arable land use, so you don't comment on. That's not about whether it's open or its scale and pattern or anything like that.
No, it's about what's in terms of the landscape element as it relates to the site, yes.
Yes. And then the next one is pasture, but I'm not sure where that's from. So should that just be struck out? You say that's moderate beneficial, but it doesn't feature in your LVIA or in your proof.
Well, we just turned to it earlier, didn't we, in terms of my proof?
Which bit was it?
So it's regarding to paragraph 6.6 at the end there, where I'm talking about meadow areas. It's the creation of the meadow area and having a beneficial effect.
Right. Okay, so that's what you're referring to there.
Yeah, this is where it would accord with the character area objectives.
Okay, that's certainly not clear from how you've assessed it, because again, you assess it as part of land use arable, and it comes up as an entirely new element in your table, but that's fine.
It's introducing a new element, isn't it? And it's something that terra firma didn't take into account.
They didn't actually. I'm very happy for you to point me to pastures in there.
No, that's what I'm saying. That's why I'm saying I've identified it here in my analysis.
Right.
It's right to identify it as a benefit in terms of the green infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful for the clarification. I'm just, again, surprised because it doesn't actually feature as a separate element, but it's suddenly come out here in the table, but that's fine. And then you've got public rights of way and you've got water features. Now, just, well, we know Mr. Dudley obviously has assessed a lot more elements or different elements, but even if we compare the terra firma list, you've helpfully put down how terra firma assesses the things that you've assessed, but what you don't do is you don't set out all the other elements that terra firma actually assesses that you don't assess. So for example, it's correct that you don't assess the open character, the openness of the site, because terra firma expressly assess scale, pattern and openness. That's not something you've looked at.
Not specifically with regard to landscape elements, no.
And you accept that their conclusion on that is that in terms of scale, pattern and openness, there would be a moderate adverse effect. And that's pages 4 and 5 of their LBIA.
Yes, that's correct. I've looked at those elements in looking at drawing these together in terms of how has an effect upon the character of the site in the last section of chapter 6.
That's not a specific, I don't see that mentioned in your LBIA. I mean, I'm happy for you to take me to where you mentioned that you've taken into account scale, pattern and openness. It's
not specifically referenced. It's picked up in the visual analysis, as I said, in terms of sense of enclosure as a visual element.
The next element that terra firma assesses is tranquility. And again, this is not something you've assessed, is it?
Not specifically, no.
And they conclude
in the general analysis.
Yes, again, but this is just sort of in terms of your own judgment and your mind, not actually in your LBIA explicitly.
No.
And just for the inspector's note, you're happy to agree that terra firma did assess this and they concluded moderate/minor adverse effect in terms of tranquility.
That's what the terra firma report identified, yes.
Yes. And then the next element is historic element that terra firma assess. Again, this is not something that you've taken into account explicitly either in your LBIA or proof.
No, because it's not something that is legible on the ground in terms of historic features.
Right, and again, terra firma conclude minor adverse effect.
Yes.
You're happy to accept that.
Well, that's terra firma's view. I don't see any historic.
No, just for the inspector's note, just so I don't have to take to the appendix and page. Thank you. And Mr. Cook, you accept that some of these features, so for example, well, let's be more specific. You accept that tranquility, for example, is a feature that's explicitly required to be taken into account by policy EM10 because we looked at that right at the start.
It is an element that you need to take into account.
Yes, and you have not explicitly taken this into account.
Not specifically as an element, no.
And if the inspector does consider these to be additional elements, as terra firma have identified, and in fact they feature in Mr. Dudley's evidence, you accept that these will therefore need to be weighed into any overall conclusion on landscape character harm.
They do, in the way that I also make reference to it in my analysis in the round.
Well, Mr. Cook, I don't think you can say you make reference to it because you don't have it in any of your documents. You've said now today that you've thought about it when coming to your judgments, but it's fair, isn't it, to say that there's no reference to these forming part of your judgment in your very detailed LBIA or your proof.
I've made reference had regard to it in undertaking and preparing the proof of evidence. It's not specifically referenced in the LBIA.
Okay, thank you for that. Right. I think then that leaves me just to go to visual impact. And this, I think everyone will be pleased to hear that this will hopefully be quite short. Mr. Cook, if you're happy to proceed through this before we take our lunch break, and Madam, if you're happy with that as well, hopefully we can wrap this up in 10 minutes or so. Is that fine?
That's fine.
Thank you. And Mr. Cook, you're happy to?
Yes, that's fine. That's fine.
Right. So I don't intend to spend too long. I think we can agree that the inspector, she's been given very helpful photographs from both sides, and she'll make her own judgment during the site visit. Very quickly, I'll just cover some very basic points. I think this is all common ground. In terms of views from the east, your conclusion is that it's the 7 acres boundary and Bond Close that are the principal areas where the site can be appreciated. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes.
And you accept that the site will in fact also be seen from Bolton's Close and Charles Down Road?
Yes, from the adjacent residential roads within the residential area of Overton to the east, yes.
Yes, and it might be helpful to just have the Mr. Cook's Appendix 21 at hand, just to see where these fall. So in terms of views from the east, or rather more generally, you say that the principal receptors will be around your viewpoints 13, 14, and then 15 is Bolton's Close and Charles Down Road, I think.
Yes, set further back, yes.
Yes. And in your summary table, and indeed in your LBIA, don't need you to take you to it, you say that the degree of effect in terms of these views are either major or moderate. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct, given the proximity, yes.
Yes, but you say that the nature is ultimately neutral to beneficial.
Yes, given the viewing context.
Of residential.
Yes, and what is proposed, yes.
Fine. Then in terms of views from the south, your proof, paragraph 8.19. 8.19. It's on page 63.
Yes, I have that. Views from the south.
Yeah. So paragraph 8.19, you say, with the scheme in place, given the fall of the land from south to north and west east, northern neighborhood would not be capable of being observed. From the south, you then say the southern edge of the southern neighborhood adjacent to 7 acres would be capable of being observed from a few nearby views afforded by gaps in hedgerow vegetation.
Yes.
But this is geographically limited.
Yes.
Now, you said today, I believe, when Mr. Boyle was taking you through your evidence, that it would be almost impossible to have views. But I just want to ask you specifically about what is your viewpoint 25. And I think it's Mr. Dudley's viewpoint 3. Or well, they're similar. Your viewpoint 25, I'd say, is the closest to his viewpoint 23. And this is the bridle way 183, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Yes, it is 183. Yes. It runs into, it's got another reference number, Overton 26. Yes, I've got that.
Yes, sorry, I think it has a couple of references.
Yes, I've got the viewpoint 25 location.
Yes, and so you can see the hedgerows, you can see the sort of the site in the very distance. But
sorry, do you want me to turn up the view? Sorry, I didn't realise.
Oh, sorry, I think it would be helpful to.
Yes, I have that.
Yes, and can I just check, is this one of the viewpoints where you accept that you would see the tops, potential tops of the houses adjacent?
It would be negligible, yes. Because the benchmark for the benefit of the inspector is that you've got 7 acres in the same location in the landscape in relation to this view. In other words, you've got it's contiguous to the site as a reference point. And it's also sharing topographic continuity.
Yes, so I just want to check. I'm not checking about the effects. I take on your point what you say about negligible.
No, I'm just going to finish the point.
Yeah.
So it's a useful benchmark engaged for the inspector. So when you look at this viewpoint 25 and you look northwards towards where the proposal is envisaged to sit, you can't see the 7-acre scheme from this location. Given it's a similar parameter in terms of scale, in terms of size of buildings, height of buildings, and it sits topographically in the same plane and distance, there would be the proposal would have a negligible effect upon this view.
Thank you. So then just turning finally to views from the west.
Yes.
Right. So in your proof, firstly, paragraph 8.21, page 64.
8.
Page 64.
Yes, I have that.
And paragraph 8.21.
Yes, 8.21, yes.
Yes. You say there towards the bottom that whilst there are more distant viewing opportunities associated with the field access gates along the lane to Turrell Hill Farm, as the proposed dwellings are set back to the east, they would be very limited. But you do accept, in fact, that you will be able to see some of these dwellings, or at least the rooftops, from that distant viewing point.
There's two gate locations, which are my viewpoints 17
yes,
and 18.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That I'm referring to. And when you take into account that the proposal set back and you've got the existing mature vegetation associated with the sunken lane, the opportunity to appreciate the proposal from these locations would be negligible. There would be very little opportunity to observe them given the degree of tree cover in the intervening distance associated with the sunken lane. So it would be negligible.
Okay, fine. So it's just because you said limited there. And of course, we have to recognize that the tree cover, well, some of it is, we'll lose some of that during winter months. And I'm just trying to clarify, because you said there would be limited views here, but in evidence in chief today, you said you would have no views. So which one?
If you look at my analysis set out in my table 3, you'll see in terms of the degree of effect for 17 and 18, it's negligible. So that's why I'm using the word limited, but it's negligible.
Okay, thank you for that
and
clarification.
You refer to the winter scene and the loss of foliage. What you also have to factor in is that boundary is also intended to be reinforced as well. So with the further reinforcement of vegetation along that boundary, that would have a greater filtering effect.
And then moving closer to the site, say I'm looking now specifically at the Western Sunken Lane, and
yes.
These are your viewpoints. Sorry. These are your viewpoints 5, 6, and 7. And
do I need
your
to turn this up?
No, I don't need you to turn them on.
Okay.
In terms of those viewpoints, your analysis is that there will be, in terms of degree of effect, it will be major on viewpoint 6, but moderate on viewpoints 5 and 7. And that these degree of effects, i.e. major to moderate, will remain in the 5-year scenario as well. That is correct, isn't it?
Yes,
just in terms of degree. Yes.
Yes, in terms of degree.
That's all I'm asking.
Neutral, beneficial.
Yes, and yeah, as you've just helpfully clarified, the nature you feel is neutrally beneficial.
So right. 4, can I just clarify those? So 4 is negligible for year 1.
I was only asking for 5, 6, and 7.
Okay, so 5 is minor. I'm just referring to my table for the benefit of the inspector. So 5 is minor.
When you say minor, do you mean minor beneficial?
Yes, yes.
They're all beneficial, yeah.
Yes, neutral, beneficial, yes. This is spectrum. And in terms of 6, that's major, but that's in the context, the viewing context that you see at the moment, which is 7 acres in place, and minor for 7.
So then, Mr. Cook, just sort of taking a step back from all the evidence that you presented on your assessment of the visual impacts.
Yes.
Is it fair for me to say that for every viewpoint and for each view that you get of this new 1705 home development and planting and green infrastructure, your view is that you will have a beneficial or neutral impact on visual receptors?
Yes, the spectrum of the nature of effects is neutral to beneficial.
And so in that, yes, thank you.
Because the scheme is a blended scheme of green infrastructure and the development area, the residential neighbourhood. And what I've ascribed in terms of nature of effect is neutral to the residential properties, as they would be in keeping with the character of the adjacent area and of a high quality design, which was accepted by Mr. Dudley. And when you look at the green infrastructure, that's reinforcing the rurality and the rural character of the locality. So that would be enhancement. So looking at the two together, you'd have that blend.
Thank you for that explanation. And just as a matter of fact, then, you agree that you're a bit of an outlier when it comes to terra firma's assessment, where they have found adverse effects, and the landscape officer who has found adverse visual effects, and of course, Mr. Dudley, who has found adverse visual effects.
Well, I would just qualify that by saying I don't think I am an outlier, because Mr. Dudley accepted that the council take no issue with the proposal in terms of green infrastructure.
I'm not sure that that's the totality of his evidence. He's looked at it in a much more granular way, and it's not for me to comment with you what his evidence might be.
And with regard to the residential element, he considered that would be in keeping and in character with the locality, in particular, the 7 acres scheme. So
we're just talking about assessment on visual impact, and
yes,
the conclusions of terra firma, the landscape officer, and Mr. Dudley is that there will be adverse effects. They disagree on the extent to which the adverse effects will be on visual impact.
That's what they've set out in their evidence. What I was going on to say is actually what I've said in terms of understanding in terms of the nature of effects as far as the residential area is concerned. This is going to be in keeping and in character, and therefore is not harmful on the eye. It's a quality scheme. It would not lead to a harmful effect upon the eye, would be neutral. And indeed, Mr. Dudley set out in his proof that we were taken to in examination that the overall, in terms of the residential element, that would not be out of character, out of keeping with the locality. Same analysis as I've drawn.
Yes, as I've said already, I was just asking you about the assessment of visual impact.
Yes, and I'm giving you my response.
So I think you, yes, thank you. Right, so in any event, as we said at the start, the inspector will have to make her own judgment. So I'm happy to leave that there. And Madam, that brings me to the end of my cross-examination.
Thank you, Ms. Preck. Mr. Boyle, before we break for lunch, can I just ask you for an estimate of time that you might need for re-examination?
Thank you, Madam. I don't have any re-examination. Thank you.
You don't? Right,
No.
okay. In that case, let me just pause for a moment just to check that I've got my questions covered as well.
I hope so. I hope. But
there was one point of clarification. You refer in your evidence at page 3, paragraph 2.9 to some watercolor visualizations. Can you tell me where I'll find those?
oh, now you're asking me.
Well, you refer to them in your evidence. I'm hoping you know where they are.
Well, they're not something, they were produced for the application, and I haven't relied upon them in my evidence, in preparing my evidence, so I'd need to find them as part of the application documents. But I will endeavour to do so. I may need to have a few minutes to track them down.
It's just I couldn't see them in the pack that I'd got, and if they were important to you, then I
haven't relied upon them in any way, shape, or form.
Madam, without digging them out directly, I note that the CD list has CD 1.23 watercolor visualizations.
Right, thank you very much for that. That's appreciating that there are a large number of documents. I couldn't quite find them when I was looking.
Okay. No, I'm still struggling to find them, but I haven't relied upon them to just qualify the point, Madam.
It's just from a point of being thorough.
Yes, understand.
No, those points have all been picked up by Miss Pratt. You'll be pleased to hear. In terms of timing, I mean, clearly this afternoon we've got a discussion on conditions and the site visit itinerary. Bearing in mind it's now 10 to 2. Are you happy to come back at 2:45, or do you want longer for the break?
I'm content, Madam. Thank you.
Likewise.
And will you both be joining after lunch, or will you be going off to do your closings for tomorrow?
Well,
the reason I ask is I just want to be content that everybody's happy with the start time for tomorrow.
Madam,
I'll certainly be on the call, although it'll be others who are dealing with the conditions issue.
Likewise, but if we are talking about start time for tomorrow, I would very much appreciate a slightly later time.
What do you mean, 10 o'clock or later than that?
11, if I may. I don't think it would take that long for us to read, and we should still hopefully be done by the usual lunch or shortly after. But I'm in your hands.
Well, I suppose that's tempered by whether or not I've got any cost applications to deal with.
None from me, Madam. Thank you.
And none from the council.
In that case, I'm going to suggest a 10:30 start, if I may, tomorrow. I'll meet you halfway, Miss Brett.
That's absolutely fine. Thank you very much.
I'm conscious that I'll be talking to others this afternoon, but we can proceed on that basis, and we'll come back at did I say 2:45 or 10 to 3? What did I say? 2:45. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Thank you.